Hi, good evening. Welcome to Wayne and Dan to stage. Yes, repeat guests here tonight at 20s and 30s. Where are we coming from tonight? How many people are from like formal Seattle that are here in the room tonight? You made it all the way across 405 or 520. Who lives up north? Okay, more from there. And yeah, Kirkland? Yeah, Kirkland, yeah. East side. I wasn't even going to say the east side. It's probably most people here. Well, hi, my name's Stefan. I help serve on the leadership team here at Reach 20s and 30s. And welcome. This is just a special space that we've been enjoying together this year, about once a month, gathering together. This is a place that is about, we're about seeking Jesus together and discovering what that means and how to do that and what it means to be the church and live out what it means to be the church in our world today. And that's something that we're all learning together. So tonight is about learning together and kind of that posture. So this is part 2 of Apologetics. Our last, actually 2 gatherings ago, was on Apologetics part 1. So some of the topics that we covered at that one, how many of you were not at the first Apologetics? Okay, a good amount, awesome. So what we covered at that one, we talked a bit about of what and why apologetics is, and I'll ask for like a 1-sentence reminder from both of you in a second of what what is apologetics. So we talked about that. We talked a lot about Jesus and the person of Jesus, the historical person of Jesus, what it means that he's God and man. We talked about the Bible, where it came from, why we can trust it, the problem of evil, of hell. What about those who have never heard of the gospel? What happens to them? So some really, really important ground and really important things that we covered. And if you want to hear more of those things, just message us through whatever platform, and we have a recording of that we can share with you. So just if you want to fill in some gaps. But yeah, I want to get started with our panel here and just have these folks introduce themselves if you weren't here, so that you can get to know a little bit more about them. So let's start with part 1 of introductions. Just what is your name, where are you from, and where do you live currently?
All right. My name's Dwayne Morris. I'm from the Seattle area. I currently live in Lake Forest Park. What else?
Do you like it there?
I like it generally.
Okay, great. Dan?
Dan Chalapalli, and currently live in Woodinville, like the Kirkland, Woodinville area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Heck yeah. Okay, so what kind of work do you currently do? And you can answer second, Dwayne. Dan, what kind of work do you currently do? And then tie into that, how did you get into apologetics and or world religions? Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I am one of the pastors at Reach Church. I work in the areas of discipleship, equipping people in their faith and community, creating spaces of folks growing in their faith together. And just love to talk about cultures and world religions. How I got into it, I grew up around a lot of religions in Hyderabad of South India. There were, at least four to five religions around me, just in my friend circle. And so got to interact with a lot of those friends. And then in my time in seminary, just felt really compelled to understand various worldviews rather than just, hey, here's the Bible, take it, believe it. Just studying those worldviews and understanding what they believe, why do they hold what they hold so dear to them, and seeing if the gospel has anything to say to them in that way. So, yeah, that was my journey. How about you, Dwayne?
Yeah, I like the ideas on the journey. So I'm going to start with that because you sparked my. But it's I always thought if this is true, there's got to be good reasons to it. When I was growing up, I said it can't just be like, well, you just have to accept it and hope it's true because it's true. It's got to. I said if that's the case that it's really true, then there ought to be really good reasons for why we believe these things. That it says and not just well, it says so. And so I got really intrigued when I started. Getting an understanding of this whole category called apologetics. And that set me into kind of what I do, which is I work with an apologetics ministry called On Reasonable Ground that I started, and we focus on working with churches or with students at the University of Washington in a small groups ministry. We have courses that we offer. Well, I do, and so it's and just love getting to engage in, why do we think these things make sense that we believe, and why, and how do we talk about it with others when it comes up. And I love seeing Christians go from I avoid conversations to actually it's interesting to me to actually get in a conversation, and they get excited about an opportunity like that, which we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, I think. So.
Well, Dwayne, you kind of just explained what apologetics is, but if you could sum it up in a sentence, what is apologetics?
Yeah, well, coming from this Greek word apologia, which means to give a defense, it's just this kind of an art of giving a defense for whatever it is you're talking about. In this case, Christianity. So and how do we go about defending specifically the why question, and answer, whether it's answering the why or to say defend. When you talk about defending, it's more like, here's this challenge that's being thrown at us. And, well, what about this? So that's where it's more defensive with them. So.
Right. Awesome. So I kind of want to take a moment before we start getting into questions to kind of just set the foundation a little bit and talk about. I kind of have a question that I want to pose to us, and just for us to think about. And I want to close our eyes, not in an overly spiritual way, but just to have a focused reflection. So close your eyes with me. And we believe that this conversation that we're about to have is not just ideas that are separate from reality. We think that God is present in the room as we have these conversations with him. And so the question that I want you to pose and just pause on for a second, which is, God, what is your posture toward my questions? God, what is your posture toward my questions, doubt, and confusion? All right. You can open your eyes. I think it's a really important question. I think that sometimes we don't even pause to ask God to show us his character when we're beginning a conversation with him. We start with these assumptions of what we think God's character is like because of how other people in our life have responded to our questions, how we felt like our questions have been welcomed or not welcomed in different seasons of life, communities of faith, communities of not faith, right? So we want to start with this question of what is God's posture towards us and what does he think about questions? That's basically the basis that we're approaching tonight with. And these are what I want to encourage you with. Jesus and God wants to be found by you. He desires to be known by you. And he also doesn't just want to be found by you, he wants to be found worthy by you, right? So he wants to know you and he wants you to know what he is like. That is his posture toward you. And so we had a good moment beforehand where I just kind of connected with Dan and Dwayne and kind of asked them this question that I just asked you to get their responses. And my thoughts kind of were, I think that Jesus invites our questions. He's not scared of our questions. If you read the Gospels and you read how Jesus interacted with people, he was constantly asking people questions and being asked questions by people. And he did not rebuke people for asking questions. He invited them because questions are real, right? A question is an admission that there is something I don't know. Right? There's an area where I lack certainty or I lack confidence, and an area where essentially I'm confused or I don't have the answers. And that's a vulnerable thing. That's a vulnerable place to be. And so that actually gets God excited because we all know, and we probably have experienced at moments, that what does vulnerability do? It invites intimacy and it invites connection. So our questions get God excited because it's actually just us being real, and it's us becoming fully aware of where we are at with God. And it's an avenue, it's an opportunity through which he wants to meet with us and have a conversation. So your questions are exactly the place that he wants to meet with you in. And I asked Dwayne this question, and this is what he said. He said, Jesus loves our questions. Because when we're asking questions, we're operating how he created us to function. He gave us minds that wonder on purpose, or curious on purpose, minds that want to know. And so we're doing what he has made us to do. We're doing what he's made our minds to do. And so he didn't make us to disengage and to not care. He made us to engage and to care and to know. And so he delights in us seeking and wanting to understand, because we're operating in who he made us to be. And Dan, I kind of wanted you to just share again how you responded. Tell us about Thomas and how you think God responds to our questions.
Yeah, Thomas spends about 3 years with Jesus as one of his disciples, with a bunch of friends. Hears all of Jesus' teachings, and Jesus then dies and comes back to life as he mentioned that he would. And Thomas was not in the room when he first appeared to all of the disciples and his friends. And he later comes in and they say, hey, a friend, our Lord has risen. And Thomas is like, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Until I put my fingers into his scars, I will not believe it. And Jesus arrives and doesn't say, how dare you? Or how could you not believe? Didn't I give you enough evidence? But simply just says, okay, Thomas, come. Put your hands where my scars were. I think that's just, I think Jesus would have been totally fine if Thomas saw that and then ended up not believing. But it was just his way of saying, come, investigate, and see if I'm for real or not. And Thomas saw that he was for real.
Absolutely. So yeah, this is just kind of foundation that we want to set on before we go into answering the questions. Because if we just went into answering the questions, I would fear that you might get the impression that what apologetics and God's posture toward our questions might be is that we're supposed to, if we don't have the answer to every question, then we are... It's like an anxious posture. Like, we need to get the answer to every question, because if we don't have the answers, there's, a rocky foundation underneath. And that's not what I hope that you walk away from tonight with. Tonight should be a foundation for, I hope that tonight is an example for how we should have these conversations and the posture through which we should approach questions, right? Less than tonight being an example of getting all of your questions answered. I hope that it would be an example of how we approach our questions. So that's just kind of our introduction before we get into it tonight. So here's what's ahead of us. We have 4 sections and basically 4 questions. We have probably 5 or actually, one's a bit longer, but kind of 4 or 5 minutes per question. But we also have, 40 minutes ahead of us. So how are we going to fill all that time? We want you guys to submit questions, please, or else we will awkwardly stop and there will be crickets like 20 minutes into talking. So if you guys have questions, and I'm sure you have questions or curiosities, go to slido.com and then enter this code. And this will be on screen up in the corner for the whole presentation tonight. Bring your questions. We would love to just all have them up here and looking at them, and we would love to respond to some on the spot. So that's it. Okay, so let's get into it. Our first area of exploration tonight is the topic of Christianity. So 2 questions, and they are, can Christianity coexist with other religions and beliefs? And how do we know that Christianity is the truth? Why is it set apart from other religions? So Dan, I think you kind of want to take that first half. What do you think?
Yeah, simple answer, yes, but I'll take 5 minutes to talk about it. What this is, the answer yes is called pluralism. Very simply, plural religions in the marketplace. Pluralism is good. It is good. What's not good is totalitarianism, where everyone is supposed to ascribe to one specific philosophy or one specific religion. And that has never gone well in history. It didn't go well with Christianity in the 3rd century, when Christendom was where the Jews and Christians stopped getting persecuted, and the emperor became Christian, and he hence legalized Christianity. No more persecution. The church diminished. They ended up torturing and persecuting everyone who didn't believe like them. Just a total disaster. And Christians themselves became very nominal and passive. So Christendom was a total fail. Totalitarian Islam in Iran is a total fail today. The same with Hinduism in India is a fail today. Buddhism in a state of India called Sikkim, where it's like you have to be of this philosophy. It never works. It's never been good. And the problem is it's not a current reality here in the US as well. Some studies have shown that our generation is the first generation since in U.S. history since 1776 where the Judeo-Christian worldview is no longer the majority worldview in the marketplace. It isn't. So what do we do with that? Tim Tennant, who's a religious studies scholar, a seminary president of Asbury Seminary. By the way, if you ever want to study religions, look up anything that Tim Tennant says, and he just makes it really intelligible and really easy to approach. But he says, we have a couple of options before us. The first is having a naked public square, what he'd call a naked public square, where it's just like shove out all religions and all conversations about theism and God, just send it all out, and what's going to be left is secular humanism or secular atheism, and that would be a field day because that's the only people that still remain in the marketplace. And so you could do that, or you could engage with pluralism. But when you do that, you've got two options. The first one is what I'd like to call hodgepodge pluralism, where we have pluralism, everyone's allowed at the table, but you're only allowed to say things that everyone can agree with. Right? You can't, no difference of opinions, just everything that everyone can agree with. And almost like a Baha'i faith, like a universal umbrella for all religions kind of a thing, which doesn't actually work. And actually everyone hates that because there's not really anything that you can align with. It's almost just like, wait, so what are we talking about right now? Oh, I'm not sure if I can align. Like, it feels like just this ethereal kind of a thing. And you can imagine a city hall prayer meeting where it's hodgepodge pluralism, and someone's asked to pray, and they say, God, we thank you for creating the world. And it's, oh, excuse me, actually, I don't believe that he created the world. I think it happened differently. Oh, okay, so sorry. Okay, God, I thank you for giving us breath to live. Oh, actually, we don't believe God gave us breath to live. We actually believe that's a rogue force that just resides in us. Oh, okay. God, we just pray for the homeless in our community. Actually, no, the homeless are suffering karma. And so what's happening to them is a result of what they did in their previous life, and that's God's will. So to pray for the homeless is to pray against God's will. Do you see how painful it is? And so that doesn't work. So it leaves us with our last option of how Christianity can coexist with other religions is what Tim Tennant would call expressive liberty pluralism. Pluralism, all religions having a space with expressive liberty where everyone can actually articulate what it is that they believe without any fear or reservations, but respectfully, right? So you don't want to do it without love. Like a version of non-loving expressive liberty pluralism would be, oh, we believe God created the world and he put his image into each of us. Unlike these other people who believe it happened by accident in an explosion, and unlike the Hindus who believe that animals and humans all have the same value and they're all divine. That's unloving because that's basically saying, hey, I am discriminating or essentially like making fun or mocking you, right? But instead, if you just do the former and you're able to share what it is that you actually believe, it would make a lot more sense. Where a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Mormon is able to just share what it is that they believe, and we have those conversations. And I think that's really good news for Christians because when we know what it is that our Hindu friends, our Muslim friends believe, we can actually know how to have a relationship with them. How do we honor them? How do we celebrate with them and the things that matter to them? How do we not offend them? And then in the integrity of our hearts, how do we share the gospel with them in ways that they could relate to or understand that answers their heart cries? So I think pluralism where you can actually express what it is that you think about is a better option.
Yeah. So this is so awesome because you, when I first read the question, we didn't talk about what we think the questions mean. But when I read this question, I read it in a different way than how you responded to it. But I think I got so much more than I was expecting from the way you responded to it. So I'm curious maybe we'll go to Dwayne and then come back. Because when I read the first question, what I was thinking was, can Christianity coexist with other belief systems in my personal beliefs? Like, can I believe in all religions and still be faithful to Christianity? So that was kind of like, it was almost like an internal, right?
Yeah.
And you took a societal and cultural apologetic side to it, which was, so deep and interesting too. But I don't know. That's kind of the other question that I had. But Dwayne, let's go to part 2, and then maybe Dan circle back on the question there.
Okay. Yeah, I just think on what Dan said, it requires that there's a respect for ideas that you don't hold, right, or agree with, and you're able to respect other people who have a different idea, and that's the necessity or necessary condition for what he's talking about to actually function. And then you're able to, because of that, if there's a mutual respect, then you're able to have a discussion and talk about things, and it's an idea, and believe what you decide is persuasive to you, right? But on the second part, how do you know Christianity is the truth? We talked. That's one of the things that we got into last time, and where we went with that was it all comes down to whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, and it's a resurrection. And if I was to say to you, I'm a Christian, but I don't think Jesus rose from the dead, I just think he's dead, you'd kind of be confused and wondering why I'm talking about this and believing it then. And so when we look at it, realize, okay, well, it all comes down to this foundational primary thing that has to be the case, which means you might call it like it's the point at which there's a falsifiable nature to Christianity itself. It's like it comes down to that, and if you don't think that's true, you shouldn't believe it.
Why is Jesus' resurrection so important to the foundation of Christianity?
To put it simply, I guess, a couple of things. It gives us a reason to actually believe it, and it's not just, hey, look, they said this guy this is what's true about him. It's no, look and see. Here's what happened. Here's what he did, as opposed to just believe because I said so. The other part of that would be what I was just saying. It gives a falsifiable point where it's something that's not just so and so said so. It's here's an event that we can examine. So what's so important is it's the nature of it being an event, the historical, that I can go and say, okay, did this really happen or not? If it didn't happen, I shouldn't believe it. I should believe this is a dead guy who's just like any other religious figure who has a lot of accolades or a lot of respect from people when we look back at them. You say, well, that's who Jesus is. On the other hand, if he rose from the dead and has conquered death as how Paul refers to it as a demonstration of his power, then you say, well, then that's the most significant thing that's ever happened in history. That someone actually conquered death. And then you have to say, well, what would that mean about someone if they have the power to overcome death? And then Paul said in Romans 6 talks about how he's conquered death to never to die again. It's not like he came back to life and then he's going to die again. It's a conquering of death, so where death has no power over him, Paul says. And then you say, well, what's the significance of that? So what it does is it poses that question to you. Okay, well, if that's the case and if this is real, then what does that mean? As opposed to just, well, so and so said that this is what happened. I can actually look at it. And so that's where I come to this conclusion. Yes, I think this is true. It's only if that's true. If that's not true, well, then there's some interesting things, but the whole thing's not true. So how it's set apart from other religions, what that really gets into is the question of, well, Jesus, the idea that Jesus is the way, as opposed to other things, and the other things are not the way, which can be a troubling thought, or it may be a question that troubles us. And so we think, what sets Christianity apart? In light of the fact that we say, okay, well, here's why it's true. Now you say, well, why is it that this is the way and it's not others? And the key thing in narrowing it down is that with Christianity, what we're saying is Jesus is the only one that solved the problem. So you have to ask, why do we need a way? So we're saying, well, Jesus is the way. Well, why can't other things be a way? Okay, stop. Why do we need a way? Well, because our relationship with God has been broken. If it hasn't been broken, then we don't need a way. So why do we need it? Okay, because it's broken and it's because of sin. Okay, well then what would qualify as a way to come in to restore that relationship? Only something that does something about the problem. And so if someone says, well, as long as you just do more good than bad, then that'll be fine. We're like, well, what does that do about the problem? There's all this, things we call sin, that's bad, quote unquote, right? And you say, well, it didn't do anything about it. So the reason we say Jesus is the only way is because we're saying he's the only one who did anything about the problem. He's the only one that's actually rescued us. Do we think someone who believes something else is stupid? No. Do we think that they're making up their, trying to make up reality? Not necessarily. I don't just jump to that conclusion. But we say what you're believing doesn't do anything about the problem. It doesn't actually solve the issue. You're not believing in someone who can do anything about the problem that we have between us and God. And so when we say Jesus is the way, we're saying he's the one that's actually rescued us and did something about it. The other way, other religions are, it might be people are deceived. They might be that they don't want to believe something about Jesus specifically, and so there might be some pressure. But but whatever their reason is, it's just that doesn't do anything to solve the problem that we have. So.
Awesome. Dan, maybe you can help bridge and segue us into the next question.
Yeah.
Which is, we'll go to the next slide. So we're going to start talking more about world religions and getting into some specific of world religions. And maybe, I don't know, in introducing like that exploration of individual ones, maybe you want to circle back around that question, right? Because we're going to talk about these distinctions between different religions. And so, like, take Jesus, for example. If Jesus is the foundational tenet of what distinguishes Christianity, a belief about who Jesus was and what he did, every world religion has a bit of a different idea of who Jesus was, right? And so, but if his claims were true and he rose from the dead, there's a proof of everything that he said. Right, because he said it would happen, and if it did, then it's a proof claim, it's a truth claim that the resurrection rests upon, right? So then, but yeah, as we go into these other religions and what distinguishes them from Christianity, how would that live in the individual as well? I don't know. I'm sure you can wrap that all together.
Yeah, I think. Kind of piggybacking off of what Dwayne said, if he didn't rise from the dead, he's just a man. If he's just a man, then we're just following a cult, and nobody has time for a cult. And so, if he too busy for a cult, but if he did rise, and that's really a central question. That if you're in this room and you aren't quite sure what Jesus means or who he really was, that's a question you need to ask: is what do I believe about his resurrection? And investigate it. He welcomes it. He welcomes you to investigate, just like he invited Thomas to check out if he really rose from the dead. And so if he did rise from the dead, that does not make him just a man, but God. And that's a world of a difference, and that demands a response. In terms of, I'd love to get into. There's two here specifically that I would love to speak on: Hinduism and Islam. Hinduism, especially because of this area in Seattle. Islam, because of its growing influence and numbers, not just in the Middle East, but all across America and the rest of the world as well. For the other ones, I would just want to leave it to time, or even just in the room here. I think, Dwayne, you're going to touch on Mormonism a little bit, maybe a little bit of New Ageism, but Judaism, Buddhism, I would love to, but it all depends on how much time we have, and if there's actually people in the room here that have those relationships or those connections that they want to learn how to reach your neighbor, how to have conversations with your neighbor. We'll do that. Sound good?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So Hinduism, there's a few things that come to mind when I think about differences between Christianity and Hinduism. One of them in particular has to do with the knowability of God. Can God be known? And if so, how can he be known? Now, the Christian worldview says that it believes in self-revelation. God has self-revealed about himself through scriptures, through prophets, and finally and ultimately through himself in the form of Jesus. And then a few scriptures after that were written about Jesus, affirming the work and the identity of Jesus. And so God's revealed himself to us. Who is he? Who are we in light of that? And what do we know about God? What can we know about God? So we might say God is love. Or we might say God is a patient God. We might say God reaches out and comes to save the sinner. God is just. God is merciful. That's because it's been revealed to us. A Hindu would call that saguna. Guna simply means attributes, qualities, and sa is saying with attributes or with qualities. So, God is just is saguna. God is just. Just is a quality. There actually happens to be two versions of knowing God in Hinduism. It's saguna and nirguna. And actually, saguna is really low in priority, preference, any value. What's higher is nirguna, which is how do you speak of God in a way that is without using attributes, if that makes sense. How do you speak of God in a way where because God is not comparable to anything. So if you were to say God is just, a Hindu hears that as a simile. God is just as a judge, right? And in India, judges aren't just. Actually, in all around the world, there's very few judges that are actually just. So when you use saguna, like actually using a descriptor, it doesn't work because, judges aren't just. So if God is just as a judge, then he's not just at all. Instead, a Hindu would look at it as, what is God not? God is not unjust is one way that they would talk about it and speak about it. And so that's a really important piece in understanding how it is that we even talk about God. And the words that we use, the human words and language that we use in talking about God, sometimes may not land well. The other differentiation is between avatar and incarnation. Avatar, just like the movie, but Hollywood just says it wrong. An avatar just means an image, a form, a representation. And it comes from the Hindu worldview, where essentially God has taken on many forms. Now, there's this cute Christian illustration that a lot of preachers use. I won't say who wrote about it in his book, because he's actually a really good theologian. But it's this idea of this pastor, this Christian pastor is in Indonesia, and he's by this massive Buddhist temple. He finds himself with a Buddhist leader and a Muslim imam. And they're having a conversation, and they say to him, "Oh, God is on top of this mountain, and each of us just has our own way of how it is that we're going to reach this mountain, right?" And then this pastor is supposedly had to say, "Well, what if I told you that God came down from the mountain? Would you then be interested?" And they say yes. And so he tells them, "Let me tell you about Jesus." Great story, I love it. The only problem is there wasn't a Hindu in that conversation. Because if there was a Hindu in that conversation, he'd say, "Oh yeah, well, God's come down many times." In fact, the incarnation is not a big deal at all because of reincarnation. God has taken many forms. There's actually been many gods that have taken on many forms and come down to earth. And so there's a difference between an avatar, a form of God who's come down for a specific purpose to save a specific person, kind of like a guardian angel sort of a thing, and an incarnation. And so that's language as well that we need to use. It's one difference point, but it's also a point of, in conversation. I'll say one more, and it's the difference between karma and atonement. Karma simply says what I did is what I will yield in the next life. I can't change anyone's karma and anyone's future, and this is the most important part, nobody can change my future. So when we come along and talk about atonement in Christian theology, saying that what Jesus did on the cross makes pardon for the sins that I have committed and my sinful state, a Hindu is like, that's bizarre. Nobody can change what I did. I'm going to get what I deserve. Or when we talk about imputed righteousness in Christian theology, that's simply saying righteousness of Christ that was imputed to us by his blood. So now when the Father looks at us, he sees Jesus' righteousness instead of ours. A Hindu is like, that doesn't make any sense. Nobody can change my future, only I can. And so there's the difference between works and karma and reincarnation versus grace and eternal life and forgiveness that's been given. So that's a couple of things that come to mind when I think about differences between Hinduism and Christianity. Which one should we do next?
Oh, you want to take turns? We can go to Mormonism.
Jump in.
Yes, you jump in.
Apparently. Yeah.
Take a breath, drink some
I'll
water.
give just a couple of thoughts on Mormonism. The big thing with Mormonism is it's using similar terms with different meanings. And so you'll hear a lot of language that if you're talking about Mormonism, and from a Mormon, you might think, well, that sounds like what we believe as a Christian. And so you think, well, maybe we do believe the same things about some important things, but there's actually a different meaning to the language that if you, I guess for me, once you start to see it and understand that, then it just really differentiates. And so the idea that, say, we'll start with, for example, I'll just give you a couple of these, but they say they worship one God. Okay. And I think that's true that they only worship one God. But then you say, but do you believe in only one God? That only one God exists? Very different question. And so you said, what are you going to find? No, we don't believe that only one God exists. We believe there's one God of this world, but there are other gods that exist for other worlds. Now, how did you get that? Well, because we have the understanding that this spirit being, what we want to do is attain godhood such that you can become the god of your own planet in the future after you die. Now, Jesus, of course, set the example of that for us. And how to do that. He'd be someone who we can look at to and say, okay, well, that's what it looks like to attain that. Well, so first thing, we believe in one God, and we worship one God as a Christian. They would say we worship one God, but of course there's more than one God that exists, and that's called polytheism. And so if you hear someone talking about, well, they're polytheistic, that's what they're talking about. It's like the difference between the existence versus what God you worship. And yes, they only worship one, because that's the God of this world. Now with Jesus, you hear the idea that Jesus is the Son of God. Well, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, for the Christian, this is the eternal God, eternal being, as God himself, who's come down to live among us and taken the form of a human and to walk among us. And then he does the things that he does and teaches us and yes, shows us how we can live as he's intended for us. And also, obviously, is going to die for us. Okay, so we believe all these things. Well, for the Mormon, they say, well, yeah, we believe Jesus is the Son of God. But not the eternal Son of God. It's the created Son of God, offspring. So you see the same terminology. Yeah, he's the Son of God. But it's the God of this world who then has children, and one of those being Jesus, who then is going to show us and give us this example and live out what this ideal life looks like, and to live it such that you can attain it. He lives that out, and so he becomes this example and this picture for us. And he shows us the way of salvation to get there. But to see the eternal always existing. No, he's a son. He's the created son. We're like, well, this is extremely different. That's not the same ideas about the core person of the entire faith, of the Christian faith. And you've reinvented what the ideas are of Christianity. And so that's where we say, well, it's deception on language, and where someone who's just a common Mormon might actually believe it in the Christian way, in the way that they're thinking about based on how they've heard it. But when you actually get into the doctrines and say, well, what are they really saying? You find here's these nuances, and it's once you see it, you're like, well, this is entirely different.
Wow.
Yeah.
And probably the core of that, for an example of that, right, is those distinctions in belief come from a belief in a different source text or a additional source text. And then the real question comes down to, when we talk about the Book of Mormon, we talk about Joseph Smith, can we trust those things like we trust the Bible? Like that's the next step towards pursuing a question like that. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And then why do you believe this?
Right.
Those texts are true, and that this is the right
and that they're compatible.
Message. And they might say, well, because of how the common answer for Mormon, I feel in my soul or in my bosom, and different language, and I've prayed about it, and I've felt this.
Right.
Well, Christianity doesn't say just pray about it and see how you feel as to whether it's true. Now, I could do the same thing, and I could say I feel it, but that's not what Christianity says to do. It actually says what we talked about at the beginning here. Actually ask questions, seek, look into it. Actually, take an interest in understanding what's true, and investigate it. And you see the apostles encouraging people to do that. You see Jesus encouraging people to do that and ask questions and want to understand.
Yeah.
So,
awesome. Come back to you, Dan.
Yeah,
I'd
do Islam. I'll do Islam. So Hinduism is drastically different from Christianity. There is no. There is maybe one or two common ground. Islam, on the other hand, is very similar. We have similar lineage or heritage, so to speak. We are both worldviews, traditions believe that we came from Adam, we came from Abraham, but then that's where the split happened. And in fact, in many parts of India and lots of parts of Asia, Christians and Muslims will refer to themselves as cousins. Because where Abraham and the Jews came from Isaac, Muslims came from Ishmael, Abraham's other son. And so very different in that sense. But other than that, there's actually a joke where a Christian and a Muslim are debating, and just before the debate, the imam, the Muslim leader, goes to the Christian and says, you Christians and Muslims, we're not very different. Like, we agree on a lot of things. If you just gave up the deity of Christ and the Trinity, we could get along just fine. And so that is Jesus, a Christ-centered worldview, is the major difference. One other point of difference is grace, how we understand grace. There's another story here where a group of Christian students from a seminary went to visit some Muslim students and again engage in some conversation and learning from each other. And a Christian student asked the Muslim student, "Do you believe in grace?" And expecting that the Muslim would say, "No, not at all. There's no grace. It's all works-based." But the Muslim actually says, "Of course, absolutely, we believe in grace. Every Muslim believes in grace. We just believe that you have to earn the grace." And that's a big difference in terms of what we believe in grace, in terms of how it's given to us freely, regardless of where we were. While we were still sinners, Christ chose to die for us, and that's grace, versus grace that's earned. The merit of God, the favor of God that's earned. So that's different. And if you talk to a Muslim, they will agree on one thing, that Allah is all powerful. And they'll ask you, do you believe that God is all powerful? And then we would say, yes, we do believe God is all powerful. However, God displays his power in weakness. God displays his faithfulness to us in allowing himself to be betrayed by his best friend, Judas. God gives us life in experiencing death himself. God gives us, he comes and rescues humans, not from afar, by becoming one of us. And that's what the Christian worldview of the incarnation. Now, the incarnation is a really big stumbling block for Muslims. In fact, it's very blasphemous. You want to tread really carefully and sensitively, especially if this is a friend that you want to keep. Because it is a very offensive point of theology. Because how can God, an all-powerful God, be born to a human? How can he hunger? How can he thirst? And how can he die? And Jesus did all those things, so he must not be God. And I think that the issue there is with an understanding, and actually with a lot of Christians as well, the issue is with an understanding of the incarnation. Because in the incarnation, what it says, the incarnation says that Jesus is not God. That's a trick statement. Stay with me for a moment. Jesus is not God. I'll say it in a less trickier way. Jesus is not only God. He is fully God, and he's also fully human. That's what the incarnation is. There's two natures present in God. And when Paul is talking to the Philippians, he explains that nature. He says, Jesus, though existing with God and having equality with God, during his life on earth, chose to humble himself, temporarily subject himself to the form of a human. And so, when Jesus dies on the cross, it isn't his divine nature, it's the person that dies on the cross. But the divine nature still lives. And so, in our conversations with Muslims, that's a really helpful point in terms of, because the big stumbling block is, how could God die? Well, he actually never did. But the person did for a specific purpose at a very specific point of human history for a very specific reason. I'll mention there's a few references to Jesus in the Quran. Some of them are really positive, and so that's a really good bridge as well. If you have a Muslim friend and say, hey, your Quran says that Jesus healed the blind man and Jesus healed the leper. Can I show you? But that's all it says in the Quran. So can I show you in the Bible a little bit more of that story, and that can produce a really good conversation. Oh yeah, let's explore that a little bit more. But there's also a lot of negative references to Jesus in the Quran. And there's about 39 to 40 of those, and they're categorized in 5 categories. The first one that talks against Jesus is that Allah can never beget or be begotten. He can never birth or be birthed. Okay, that's the first one. Keep that in mind. Second one is, second category, when it talks about Jesus, it says Allah cannot have any partners. Okay, so that's the second one. Remember, now the third one is about the Trinity. When it talks about Jesus, says the Trinity is blasphemous. The fourth one being, the Quran condemns elevating a human prophet to a divine status. And the fifth one being, the Quran is against Mary, the mother of Jesus, being worshipped. Now, these are positions of Christianity that significantly offend Muslims. They should offend us too. Because as Christians, we've rejected all 5 of these beliefs. Right? But the very first one, Allah can never birth or be birthed. The birth here that's talking about is literally physical procreation, sexual procreation, and it's very similar to Mormonism, that God had an offspring through sexual intercourse. We've already rejected that in the 4th century. And then the second one, Allah cannot have any partners. Well, he did not. The partner here is not Jesus. The partner here that Christians are accused of is Mary. And we know there was 0 relationship between Yahweh and Mary. So we should reject that second one as well. The third stumbling block is the Trinity. But the Trinity, as a Muslim would explain it from the Quran, is God the Father, Yahweh, Jesus the Son, and can you guess what the third one is? No? So it's not the Holy Spirit, it's Mary, God the Mother. And we've rejected that too. Where there still are streams of Christianity that believe in the deification of Mary, what they call Theotokos, a God-bearer, one that bore God, should also be God herself. And Orthodox Christianity doesn't hold to that. We've historically rejected that. The fourth one being elevating a human prophet to divine status. That was also in the 3rd century in a stream of Christianity called Arianism that believed that Christ was the first of all creation. God created Christ and then he created the rest of creation. So he is the greatest of all creation. Well, at the Council of Nicaea in the 3rd century, from where we get the Nicene Creed, we rejected that as well. We rejected Arianism and said that Christ is not a human prophet that was elevated to divine status. He was with God at creation. And so a lot of these things they tend to be open doors to conversations because they are beliefs that we ourselves reject. What I believe the problem was in the 6th century when Muhammad received revelation from Angel Gabriel to write the Quran is he did not have exposure to Orthodox Christianity. The Bible was not yet translated into Arabic, and so he was listening to folk religion of Christianity where the belief was it was God the Father, Jesus, and Mary. And we also would support our Muslim brothers by saying that, no, that's blasphemous. That's not true. We don't believe in 3 gods. We believe in one God who took on 3 persons, right? And so that's where the whole pluralism with expressive liberty, where a Muslim gets to share what they actually believe, and we get to share what we actually believe, and there's an open door of conversation there where we're not having a discourse on caricatures, but we're having a discourse on facts. Like, what do you actually believe? And let's talk about that rather than what is folk religion and kind of like mystifying about that. Yeah.
Awesome. So we're going to steer a little bit earlier into Q&A because some of these things talk on science, which is kind of the main next question. But there's also just a lot of good follow-ups to the topics we've already been covering. So go ahead and, just so you guys know, you can vote on questions that were submitted to kind of bring them to the top about which ones you're most interested in. But we will get into these here. This is probably a good bridge, and it's the top voted question right now. This is the question. What would you say to the atheist argument that geography is a primary driver for religious belief, i.e. those born in India believe in Hinduism? So when I read this question, it sounds, well, and first of all, I just want to pause and acknowledge anyone who's asking these questions, it's removed from the person, right? And so we talked about this last time, but there's a story behind each of these questions, right? So we want to pause and just acknowledge these are people, these are stories, and there could be a number of different reasons why these questions are coming up for somebody. So. What do you say to the atheist argument that geography is a primary driver for religious belief? And I think maybe the question or the heart of what's really being asked here is the only reason people believe Christianity is because they're born into it. Do you know what I'm saying? Rather than, because I think it's kind of obvious, geography is a primary driver for religious belief because you're going to be associated and learn from the religion you're around, and be influenced in that way. Yeah. But is that the only, right? Do you know what I'm saying? The question behind the question is like, is that the reason why Christianity is influential here, or is that why people believe it? It's just because we're born into it. Yeah.
I'll be honest, I've never heard that question before, but I do have a comment on that. I don't believe geography influence primary influence, yes, but I don't believe geography is why someone chooses a religion. I'm not exaggerating when I say that there are Jewish Indians, there are white Hindus, there are Mongolian Muslims, and those are the only 3 facts that I know. And these are friends and acquaintances that I know. And so you have to wonder, because again, this question is not about Christianity. I'm responding to atheism. But there is literally, people have essentially investigated and come to a conclusion that I think this is accurate. And even though they didn't grow up around it, it is what they've chosen. So for instance, Buddhism, it was birthed in India. Today, there is about 0.001 Buddhists in India. And the majority of them are in Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia. And so there isn't a allegiance based on geography. There might be an exposure based on geography, but allegiance comes from investigation, examining. A lot of times revelation, like people will in their dreams, whether you're, again, this is not specific to Christianity. People from all religions will, in their dreams, come to the revelation that, wow, God appeared to me. This is the way and I should follow, and it has nothing to do with geography.
That's really insightful. Thanks for that perspective.
I think exposure is a great word to use there. That yes, it does. The geography impacts your exposure. As far as how I've thought about this question was I've looked at Christians, or let's say people who have grown up identifying themselves as a Christian in the United States. And we think about these percentages of people who do so and then have abandoned their faith or give up on their faith. And they say, well, I don't buy it anymore. And if you say, now we might think, well, that's, a really negative thing. Okay, well, we don't like the idea. But what we see that's coming from is that person has the freedom to make decisions about what they believe, and as life is going on and they're asking questions and thinking about things, they maybe come to the point where they're like, I just don't see it. It doesn't make sense to me. Well, we see that with Christians, we see that happening, and we see that we have this ability to do it. Well, we don't think people growing up in these other geographically different locations around the world, that they don't have the ability to do that. Of course they do. And so you'd understand, okay, we have all these people who we run into, and they're like, well, I'm Muslim or I'm Hindu, but they're like, well, I don't practice it. That's just like, it's a cultural thing. Or I'm Jewish, but, well, I don't practice. I'm just cultural. Like, they've done the same thing. And what they've done is over time they've gone, well, I don't really take this seriously. I don't buy at least certain aspects of it, and I've kind of walked away from living out what this was supposed to look like. Maybe they still identify it culturally, whereas you don't have that push in the United States to identify it with it culturally. But we see that all across the world, these people have that freedom to assess it, and whatever that they've been brought up with, and say, well, do I buy that or do I not? And so I think that's great because, I want someone to investigate Christianity and be like, oh no, I do understand it and I believe it, and to stick with it. But I'm glad that we have that ability, because then someone who grows up in another environment where they don't even get exposed to Christianity, they don't even know much about it, other than that it exists, they have that same ability to contemplate what they've been taught and what they grew up with, and decide if they really buy into that as well. Yeah. The problem is more when you have countries that it's like, we don't allow this even in.
Right.
And that's where they have this obstacle that I think, that seems like that's something that would come from the enemy.
Totalitarianism kind of thing.
Where it's like, we don't even allow that as something to be considered, and we don't allow Christians to come into our country, and that's a whole different spiritual warfare thing.
Yeah. Thank you for voting. It's helping me prioritize here. We have about 10 more minutes, so we are not going to get to all of the questions, obviously, but there's a couple ones I for sure want to hit. I just want to jump in real quick on one, and it had to follow up with the coexist question that we started with, which is, does Reach believe that there is more than one way to salvation? And I think it's a lot of it, because when I see the coexist sticker, right, it's kind of like, it tends to seem to agree with the worldview that, all religions teach the same thing, that kind of thing. And just brief on this one.
Super brief, yeah.
Super brief on this one.
I'll give you the next one. Well, since it was a Reach question, no, Reach does not believe all roads lead to Rome. There's many ways to salvation. There's many ways to climb the same mountain. There's many ways to describe the same elephant in different ways. We actually don't. It's actually, if you can study the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith is the truest form of the coexist sticker. No Muslim will look at the coexist sticker and say, yeah, that's cool. No. No Buddhist will look at because Buddhism doesn't believe in God. And so they won't look at that and say, yeah, that's cool. A Christian certainly wouldn't and say that's cool. A Hindu might, but not to the fullest extent of what the coexist sticker is saying. As long as there is Islam and Christianity on that sticker, no Hindu is going to say yes to that, because Islam and Christianity claims exclusivity. Islam says there's only one God, and anything else is blasphemy, right? And Christianity is saying that there is only one God. Yes, that God has made himself known to us in the form of Jesus, And Jesus shows us the way. So by very nature of saying, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, the sticker doesn't work. So
Yeah, and this is a good bridge to one of the top-rated questions, which is when asked, how do I defend the fact that those who accept Jesus are the only ones who go to heaven without appearing hateful or discriminatory? So something you're touching on is that the actual core religions that are on something like the coexist sticker also make exclusive claims in some specific area.
Yep.
And so when I were to talk about somebody about how the core tenets of my faith include exclusive claims as well, how can I do that without appearing offensive or hateful?
do you want to take the tough one?
Well, I think there's even just some insight in the question and that right there, because just to acknowledge that every worldview actually has exclusiveness to it is itself kind of settling the question a little bit. Because, right, we just said the core, people of the religions on the coexist sticker are offended by the coexist sticker because the coexist sticker excludes their beliefs. And in its own way is exclusive. It's making an exclusive claim about what is true, which is that all religions are true. Yeah.
So the idea that there's an exclusive means of salvation is not exclusive to Christianity, right? So with any religion other than, as what Dan mentioned about the Baha'i, that's what you're going to get. How was the question stated again?
When asked, how do I defend the fact that those who accept Jesus are the only ones who will get into heaven without appearing hateful or discriminatory?
I mean, there's places to start. I mean, what we just said would be a place to start, and knowing that this is across the board, no matter what religion, other than the one. And then I think it's helpful. Gosh, say it.
I'm going to move you into the.
Read it again. Okay. I'm losing my thought.
When asked, how do I defend the fact that those who accept Jesus are the only ones who will get to heaven?
Got it. The key thing would be, so when you go back to Judaism and you say, okay, in Judaism it was like thought of as distinctly for the Jews, and I want them to understand. And now people could come in, but there was a process of it was like becoming a Jew,
right?
And there's all this process you went through to align yourself now with the Jews, and and this grafting in. Well, we're like, so that was how it was, and there was a purpose to that, which we could explain. But then we say, well, then Jesus came, and what Jesus did is he opened it up for all of us. And so what I'd really want to emphasize is how Jesus has opened up it very differently, that this is for everyone, that we're all given this opportunity. And the issue is, well, when you go back up and you say, well, if there's a God, and there's one God, then what's true about that God would be specific. And the person or the being who would get to decide how do you come into a relationship with him and how does that go about and how do we deal with the problems of humanity is not us, it would be him. He's the one that we get to decide that. And we say, so there's deeper questions of, well, is this God real? And if this God is real, then the other gods' ideas of God aren't. And then this is the God that gets to decide on how we come into that relationship with him. And so now what it really is assess it, look at the reasoning, talk about it, and be like, okay, well, I think I understand this, and I find it convincing, or I find that that's true, or I could be like, I don't buy it. Well, fine, that's your freedom. You have that right to just say, I don't think this makes sense, or that this is true at all. And we say, okay, we respect that. That's everybody's right, and it's not there's not some demand that you have to believe it, but it's open to everyone. And what it's about is, hey, assess it and look into it and really try to understand.
Awesome. Okay, Dwayne, I want you to take us right into the next one because it's hot. It's the top most voted question, and it's the area we've skipped so much. So rather than just doing a broader question, which the broader question around science was, can science coexist with the Christian beliefs?
Yes.
And I think that's a really important question. It's also broad, and I would wager to say that a lot of people have worked through that vaguer question to a degree for themselves already. Not that it's not important or that you already have. But the specific question that was submitted is specifically around the topic of evolution.
Okay.
Can you help explain evolution? What is the idea of it? And many different ideas of what it is, and how could that how that fits into Christianity, or does it fit? Yeah. Yeah.
Did he tell you to answer this one?
Well, I just yeah.
On the general part, first I'll say
you can touch on it. Yeah.
that we get this
last
idea
question.
where people say like, well, I used to believe in God, but now I believe in science. Maybe some kind of a statement like that. And you say, well, you're making an assumption. The assumption here is that those don't go together. I would say that's similar to, it's a false dichotomy, similar to saying, well, I don't believe in, I used to believe in God, but now I believe in math. Like, well, why are those opposed to each other? I used to believe in God, now I believe in baseball. Like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what there's more for them to say as to why that doesn't go together. I used to believe in God, now I believe in humanity. Okay, well, the reason that I agree with you, I believe in humanity. The reason I believe in humanity is because of what God has done and how He's created us and the gifts that He's given us. So that's why I believe it. So those aren't opposed. So when you're talking about this more of a conflict, usually it comes up in the thoughts is where you took that is going into an evolutionary idea. Mm-hmm. My initial thought on that is that it has to do with what do we mean by evolution? Like, what are we talking about? Okay, so there's different aspects of evolution. Now, first on a full Darwinian evolutionary theory is let's say it eliminates God and it's trying to explain to you, here's how this would happen and how life would come about, assuming that you have a universe and a world and stars and all that, assuming all that, here's how you would get life if there's no God. And that's fine to learn about it. But like, okay, this is how it could possibly be if there's no God. Now, if there's a God, on the other hand, then we say, well, that full explanation of it is not going to work because the most influential aspect of the whole thing has been left out, and now I'm bringing that in, which is actually a being who has a will and intentions and stuff and is actually, active. So then you get into those different ideas of what someone means by evolution. Now they say, well, I mean some kind of distinction between macro and micro evolution. Now, I don't know how familiar we are with these terms, but there's a macro evolution being evolution from one species to another through a process that involves what's the word? Where they have it's natural selection, but they have the mutations is the word I'm looking for. There's mutations, these happen, and now you get another species. You've got this microevolution, which we would say it's these small changes that are coming within the species. Now, within Christianity, I mean, this could go on for days. So I'm going to try and I'm skipping tons of things. If you know a lot about this, this could evolve. But if you're like living on this topic, like understand, I know I'm skipping all sorts of things. But when trying to connect that with Christianity doesn't have any problem with microevolution which is within species. And so some people are, within Christianity are going to say, well, I don't buy that. Others are going to say, well, we are. But that's not really that's not something that is problematic for Christianity, is what I'm saying. Different people have different ideas on that. Where you get more contention is on this macroevolution idea, and then people are saying, well, that doesn't make any sense if there's God, and so it would be some might say it doesn't make sense on any level, but others are going to say, well, God wouldn't do that, right? So God would just create. He doesn't need to take it. Now, that would be more of a creationist idea. Then you have people saying in this idea of theistic evolution where God is using things, and what I want you to see is when God comes in and is using this process of evolution and natural selection and mutations, that means there is no random mutation on that view. Do you understand that? That's why the whole the strict Darwinian evolution doesn't even work at all, because all of a sudden there's no such thing as a random mutation. Each of those mutations would be intentional on the part of God, causing it to happen and bringing it about for a purpose. And so now that's going to require, obviously, there's long periods of time. Some people in Christianity are going to be like, well, I don't accept that. They might say, well, I see how that could work, but I don't accept it because I don't accept the long period of time. And they think it's, like more of a younger Earth. So they're not going to go there. Others are going to say, no, I'm okay. I embrace like a longer period of time throughout like geographical history. And so God could do that throughout that time period. And there's a lot of different ways of understanding how that would go together with Genesis, and they're okay with it and embrace it. And that's more of that could be like what they call an internal battle, where it's not so much of a conflict between Christians and atheists, but more of a conflict within the church, where people land. I like saying, I like to interject on this discussion that there's a third option, because a lot of times people will say like, well, there's either you're a young Earth and no evolution at all, or you're old Earth and it's all theistic evolution. And I think that those two options, yes, exist. I think it's reductionist, that there's a third option in the middle, which would be you have a long history of the Earth, so an old Earth, but it's a creationist. So there's young Earth creationists, then there's also old Earth creationists, who would incorporate a lot of microevolution, like on a large scale of microevolution, but within species. And to say, so we could embrace like geologically, say an older Earth, but it's all creationism in the sense that God has created each species specifically. And I think it's important to talk about that, because sometimes people go, well, I understand how life could come about. Like if God was creating life, God, I see how if there's a God, he could do it that way and just create directly, called special creation. And but they say, but the Earth there's all this evidence that it's old. And so now I don't know how to even get past this to start thinking about Jesus and stuff. And where that view is helpful for that person to say, okay, look, there can be an old Earth and creationism where it's direct and it's specific, like a lot of Christians would believe in. And now we can move on and into other things, seeing, okay, there's a lot of different ways this could be, and I could move into let's get to Jesus, because that's what we really want to talk about, and it helps us move on and talking about there's different options. And so I've kind of gone about it that way, where I was like, there's different options of how it works out, and all of them can be consistent with Christianity, but you don't have to be stuck on it's just this one or this one, and that's all there is, and I have a hard time with both. Yeah. There are other ideas, and then how it works out on an old Earth creation theory. I mean, John Lennox is a person who's talks about that really well, a lot, on understanding the different ideas. But it just opens up that there's a lot of options for you. But the Christians will have different views on that and how it works, and could God have done it a certain way? One approach that, and kind of what I'm thinking, well, oh yeah, I wouldn't have any reason to think that's the way he did it on this long way, but is it feasible? Well, sure, there's a feasible way, and you could break that down and figure out what that looks like. Do I have reason to think that that's how he did it? I don't know. Then it's more that for that each of us individually have to kind of assess what reason do I have to think it was that way, or that doesn't make sense to me. I think it was this way, more of special creation and young. Okay, well, what's my reason for thinking that? And why am I getting to that conclusion, etc. So it's, and then we should be able to talk about it and just help each other think about things. Well, what do you think about this? Rather than, well, I don't agree exactly with him, so now I'm frustrated with him because he doesn't think it the way. It's like, well, as long as somebody's not saying, well, I know exactly how it happened, because then I'm confused. How did you know exactly how it happened? But we're trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Awesome response. Obviously, it's a huge
Yeah.
conversation. I feel like that response was more just like, well, here's a state of the conversation and how
Yeah.
people began it, which is great. I think it probably reflects like a lot of the posture that we talked about tonight, which is these questions are worth asking, and it's not just the excuse to say, here's your options, go choose what you want to believe. It's just to say people have been thinking about these questions very deeply and should encourage you that there are deep thinkers and if you value knowing answer to these questions, there's people that have thought very deeply about them. So I would encourage you to go and seek, to go and find. And go deeper into your questions, right? If you're sad that one of the like a dozen or more questions on here didn't get answered tonight, go and seek. Jesus wants to meet you and have a relationship with you in that area of questioning. And we will also be sending out, we don't have time to touch on resources right now, but we will be following up again like Kelsey did after the last one with recommended resources. So if you didn't register for this event or you haven't been on the email list, register for the event tonight and you'll get on that email list that we'll send those resources out for. Can we thank Dan and Dwayne so much? Thank you so much. Yeah. Not just for the time for being here tonight, but for the time I know you put into just preparing and having a response ready.